Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of our Sotterley Presents People and Perspective. My name is Nancy Easterling, and it is my honor to serve as the Executive Director of Historic Sotterley. I just want to take a moment to thank all the people who make this series and all the work that we do possible. All of our community partners, check them out on our website. They're incredible people, our supporters, our members. If you're interested in joining the Sotterley family, we welcome you. We could not do it without the support of all of you. Just a little housekeeping tonight as you're signing in. Do please sign in to the chat. Let us know where you're joining from tonight. For those of you who aren't as familiar with this platform, maybe haven't joined us before, there is not only a chat, but within that you can choose a Q&A. Please, anytime during the evening, feel like you can go ahead and ask a question. If we don't get to it right away, we will try to get to as many questions that we can at the end of our presentation tonight. So when I was planning these events this year, the theme for this year's Common Ground is Talking and Walking Common Ground. Last year, we premiered a video that we had created through the help of the Maryland Humanities and the Maryland Heritage Area Authority. It was Talking and Walking Common Ground, a 17-minute video that's still available on our website and featured a lot of our descendants who are part of our story. We had a presentation in April, I believe it was, no, March. It was in March, sponsored by our local library, where we screened the movie again, and then we had a talk with our descendants. You are welcome to view that at any time. It is hyperlinked off our YouTube page and off of our website. But tonight takes that Talking and Walking Common Ground to another step. It is a shared vision in action. Tonight, I am joined by two of my absolute favorite people who are also helping to lead historic sites that are interpreting a full and inclusive history, and that descendants are part of how that is going on. If you have been following our speaker events for years, you are already familiar with both of them because both of them have joined us in the past. But let me give a good formal introduction to them both. Elizabeth Chu, who first joined us, you were right, you said earlier it was 2012 for our speaker series when you were still at Monticello with Rex Ellis, and that was wonderful. She is the Senior Director of Museum Programs and Chief Curator at James Madison's Montpelier, where she oversees the curatorial, education, and research departments. An art historian, she holds a BA from Yale, an MA from the Courtauld Institute at the University of London, and a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has worked at museums and historic sites since 1985. At Montpelier, she has oversees the excavation and reconstruction of 6 slave dwellings and work buildings, the creation of the exhibit, The Mere Distinction of Color, winner of 6 national awards and the National Summit on Teaching Slavery. So impressive. As curator at Monticello for 13 years, she was instrumental in expanding interpretation to include women, slavery, and domestic work. She curated the exhibit To Try All Things, Monticello, an Experiment in the David M. Rubenstein Visitor Center, and was co-curator with Rex Ellis at the National Museum of African American History and Culture of the exhibit Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, Paradox at Liberty. That was when you came and spoke to us. She has taught art history at the University of Virginia, James Madison's University, Wake Forest University, and Davidson College, and published and lectured widely on ways that architectural patronage and art collecting relate to gender, race, and family politics. She was also part of our first year of Common Ground when we did Building Bridges to Common Ground, and you were talking with us then as well. We are so thrilled to have you again, Elizabeth. Oh, yay.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's wonderful to be back with you.
Oh my gosh. And if you came to our first day of Unity last year, you got to see our wonderful friend Maya Davis, who also has been a presenter for us. Maya, in 2021, you were one of our early virtual events when you talked about your life in history. So let me tell you a little bit about this incredible woman who is joining us tonight. Maya Davis is the director of the Riversdale House Museum, the former 19th century plantation home of George and Rosalie Calvert, as well as generations of enslaved families held in bondage. Prior to her arrival at Riversdale, Maya was a research archivist and legislative liaison at the Maryland State Archive when she consulted on statewide projects that documented, interpreted, and preserved African American history and culture, and facilitated discussions on state legislature and prepared statements for contemplated legislation. And that's when we first met you, when you were at the state archives. Some of her legacy projects include the installation of the Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman statue at the Maryland State House, the Annapolis Port Marker Project to commemorate the landing of African slaves who survived the Middle Passage, and the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Park and Visitor Center. She currently serves as a commissioner on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, and is a board member for Prince George's County Historical Society. Previously, she served as interim director of the Banneker Douglass Museum and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, staff at the City Museum of Washington, D.C., and vice chair of the Annapolis 1864 Commission to commemorate the emancipation of slavery in Maryland. A native of Washington, Maya is graduate of Howard and George Washington Universities, where she obtained degrees in history and museum studies. So let me just tell you, these women are so impressive, and I get to call them my friends. So I am so glad that we're all here tonight to start talking about this vision and action that we are on a journey with our organizations. So just to get us started, I wanted to know if both of you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about your organizations. I'm hoping a lot of our visitors have seen your sites, but may not be familiar with the size, the scope, what your mission is. So Maya, you're on my right-hand side right now.
Oh, wow.
Maya, if you could tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll go down to Elizabeth.
Okay, well, if I had to describe Riversdale, I would say that the one thing we probably say the most, and what I've seen over the years, even before I got there, is that we are a National Historic Landmark, which is very important. But the one thing that we never did say was that we were a National Park Service Network of Freedom designated site, where enslaved people had actually fled from the site. So I try to be intentional about what I'm saying when I speak about Riversdale, because we are a museum in transition. We are a museum that is transforming how we show up to the community and the public. And we want to do our due diligence to make sure that all of the people who come to our museum feel seen, they feel heard. And, it's really a challenging time because, it shakes things up when you start to do it. We are not the first museum to undertake this type of work, but we are one of the museums that are doing it in 2023 post-pandemic. We've seen a lot of different opinions related to race relations in this country. And I think that we are at the epitome of it because we are one of the founding houses. When you think about the founding of the American colonies, our house, which was built in 1801, the family had been here since the 1700s, is just really impressive to me. And the Calverts, that name rings loud and true. They are the proprietors of the state. And so we have that legacy that's also connected to us. And our museum, it's really facing an interesting history. Like it's once was like 2,000 acres. So everything around it, all of our near neighbors in this urban setting, have no idea what their connection was to this former plantation home from the 19th century. So everything from our property, which is now like only 7 acres, is all the way down to UMD and beyond. So it's really impressive to kind of see where our museum is going to go in terms of connecting with an ever-changing community as we go forward. So I'll stop there because I feel like I don't want to start answering questions that you may answer.
So Elizabeth, over to you. If people haven't heard of your site, I don't know what's wrong with them, but they may not have been there. So describe a little bit and what your mission is.
Sure. So Montpelier was the plantation of 3 generations of the family of James Madison, father of the U.S. Constitution and 4th president, and lifelong enslaver who never freed a single person. We've been open to the public as a public historic site only since 1987. The property is owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and run by the Montpelier Foundation in co-stewardship with the National Trust. A year ago, Montpelier made history by becoming the first former site of enslavement to create a relationship of shared power and authority in governance with the organization that represents the descendants of those who were enslaved by the Madison family between 1723 and 1844. We are located in Orange, Virginia, in the middle of nowhere, but it's only about 90 miles south of DC and about 30 miles north of Charlottesville, Virginia, in a very beautiful rural setting. And we have 2,700 acres. So land stewardship is part of what we do as well. And we are dedicated to what we say is telling the full truth of our shared American origin story.
Yeah, you two both have such different realities. You are so in such a rural area, and Maya, you are right down there in a very populated area. And when you step onto your campus, it's like you kind of go back in time a little bit, but you can still hear the city noises around you. So you have a very different reality.
It's so true. When I heard Elizabeth say she was 90 miles south of DC, I'm like, I'm just 2 miles west.
And you know, we're closer to Elizabeth. When you look at, for those of you, if you haven't been to Sotterley, we're down in Southern Maryland, and we currently administer 94 acres and have over 20 historic buildings. And we're fortunate enough to still have an 1830s slave dwelling, which has certainly been a linchpin to part of the way that we tell our story. But it is, we interpret 300 years of history, which most people are not going to be crazy enough to take that on. But we start in 1703 and go through the mid 20th century or late 20th century. And it has actually provided us opportunities for discussion that are different than sites that need to focus on one family or one era. It has provided challenges, but also opportunities, we have found. And our site, like so many, in the earliest days when the last owner started the nonprofit in 1961, for years when it was still owned, the site was still owned really until the time of her death. There were a lot of wonderful romantic stories that were passed down, and it started as a Sotterley Mansion Foundation. It was about the older historic house and the stories and it's funny, I'm sure you guys experience the same thing. I would go to other historic sites and go, oh my God, they've got the same stories we do, because there were these romanticized stories that were cycled around, and it took a while to start moving away from that. And I wanted to find out from both of you, when did your organizations start moving toward a more inclusive history? I would say ours was in the 1990s, when the last owner, who had reached out to Agnes Kane Callum, who was descended from those enslaved, she came on the board, as did John Hanson Briscoe, whose family had owned her family. And these descendants were on the board at that time. That started a difference for us. It started on, and it's been a long journey, but that started. When did it start with both of your organizations? Who wants to start?
I'll start. I would be selfish and say it showed up when I got there, but that may not be true. I would say probably late 90s, early 2000s, when the only surviving outbuilding that we have on our site, the dependency, was used to in a dedication towards the life and legacy of Adam Francis Plummer, who was enslaved at our site. He had a very dedicated group of descendants who gathered around him, and they dedicated the building and actually started doing interpretation in that space of what slave life would have been like. And it is like the only thing we have. We don't have an extant slave quarter, which I'm very upset that we don't have, but we have the dependency building. And I know that Reverend Jerome Fowler, who's like one of the more prominent descendants, was very integral in getting that work. And what has been so fortunate for us is we are not only one of a few places in Maryland, but one of a few places in the country where we have an enslaved person who actually documented his experience during the 19th century. And so his diary, which unfortunately we don't own, is owned by the Anacostia Community Museum. And so it is relatively local to us, and we have it at our fingertips to actually access. It was digitized and placed online for the public to see through an online exhibition. But during updates, of course, those types of things, they go down and they go away. But we do have it, and we try to tell as much of that story as we can. And so I would say late 90s, early 2000s is probably when we start to do that work. But I think we didn't continue it in a way that we could have in terms of relationship building, and what Elizabeth has done so wonderfully down in Montpelier to really look at that shared space of co-ownership of how we tell these stories and how we present it to the public.
So one thing that's really lucky for us at Montpelier is that we didn't open to the public until 1987. So it's about 120 years after Mount Vernon, and like 65 years after Monticello. So we don't have any backtracking to do or any corrections to make. You know, we started off pretty well. And the National Trust did archaeological research to understand slavery, the landscape of slavery. Descendants, the first descendant to ever come to Montpelier was Dr. Betty Kearse, who first came in 1992. And descendants came also in the later 1990s when the National Trust archaeologists identified the location of the cemetery of the enslaved, now called the Montpelier Burial Ground. So we're really lucky in that. And then the co-stewardship agreement was signed in 2000. And so the Montpelier Foundation took over then. And they hired the same year my colleague, Matt Reeves, director of archaeology. And he is really the staff member who is to be credited with his incredible commitment to working with descendants from the very beginning of his time. He's now 23 years there. He started right away working with Rebecca Gilmore Coleman and her family. And Rebecca's great-great-great-grandparents, George and Polly Gilmore, were enslaved at Montpelier, freed, and then were able to acquire property where, which now across from the main entrance of Montpelier and part of our property still. There's an extant, their home that they were able to acquire has been restored, still in its original location, and we have it open to the public. And Matt worked with the Gilmore family from the very beginning, from tearing off the weeds and figuring out what the building was to restoring it. So everything we've done to interpret African-American history since 2000, and really even before, has been done with the collaboration of the descendant community. But the relationship wasn't formalized until the descendants created their own private independent 501c3 in 2019. It's called the Montpelier Descendants Committee. And that's an official organization that's legally the same as the Montpelier Foundation. And they are the representative organization for all the descendants. So it's really been an evolution, but it's had a lucky start in that it started late.
No, I was always one of the first times I went to Montpelier. You were in the process of taking off a lot of the facades and deciding what to put back in. And one of the things I was so impressed about, they said, we don't have all the answers yet, but we're looking. And I thought that is a pretty cool thing to tell everybody, to say that we're still finding the way that's the right way. And we're going to tell you what we know. We're not going to tell you necessarily the fun stuff that you think you're going to hear, but we're going to tell you the stuff that we know, and we're still there. And I thought more people should take a notice of that, because that was pretty amazing. There was one question that came up, and Maya, it was just a clarification for a term that you use. What is the difference between a dependency and a slave dwelling?
Well, the dependency would have been occupied by more than enslaved people. You would have had white workers also living in the dependency. It was a house that was used to support. And we know that we had 9 slave dwellings that no longer stand. They are They were near what is modern day College Park Academy, which is an elementary school not far from us, about 6 minutes. And so, a slave dwelling is a place where only, in my opinion, enslaved people would have dwelled. It's not a place where the Calverts or anyone, even who was an indentured servant, would have actually stayed. Indentured servants could have stayed in the dependency. And the dependency is a building that is like right near the house. It's like a thing that services the house right away. So if they're doing cooking right there, it's immediate that it's going there. You're not getting that same slave work that's taking place over in the dwelling house.
Thank you for that clarification.
But I will say, I would not, even though we have like conflicting documentation, I think that, enslaved people probably did live in there. So it could be considered one of the dwellings, as much as the mansion house itself also housed enslaved people. So everything is a slave dwelling at that point, but, just to kind of clarify for the audience.
And that point is such an important point to make. In fact, when Joseph McGill was here, we've had him sleep here twice with the Slave Dwelling Project. The first time he slept in the cabin, and the second time, some people slept in the cabin, but he slept in the manor house, because it's not as though enslaved domestics were going to, they were expected to be right there tending the fires, and you were going to curl up in a corner somewhere that was allowed for you. There was definitely going to be, there's such involvement in so many buildings throughout this country that we never think have a real intertwining with the story of slavery. And it's so important to remember. Look at the White House. You look at so many buildings that we don't think about, and that's part of our stories. So one of the things that I know that you all have encountered, we certainly have, there have been, the journey on trying to find the right path is not easy. And I know we certainly had fits and starts here. One of the things that I remember clearly is when I first came on board, and the executive director before me had gotten a grant, and what they were trying to do was find a place to make sure that they were cementing in the story of these who were enslaved here. And they were going to take the larder, which was at the time just used for storage, and now we actually have it as part of the tour, and they were going to put an exhibit in there about slavery, and wasn't able to follow through. It didn't happen. And I'm glad that it didn't, because it would have been very easy to then just say, I'm here at this spot, I'm going to check the block, I'm going to talk about it here, and then I can keep going. If we had done that, it would have been easy for the organization to accidentally fall into that path of siloing it and saying, I have it over here, that's enough. I don't have to go through the difficulty of trying to integrate that story everywhere. And for us, finding that right path, there had been a lot of changes that have had to come through, like a reinterpretation plan and redoing your tours and your guided tours. Oh my heavens, is that painful? And creating new exhibits here, new stories. Tell me some of the things, and that's just internally. Those were internal challenges of trying to make the right choices. But there are also challenges that come internally, culturally, about making that shift. And there are external challenges that we have of pressure to do things a certain way. So I wanted to open the floor up to you both to talk about what some of those challenges have been for your organization. And it's going to be, I'm sure, a combination of both internal challenges as far as choices, internal pressures from people who want things done a certain way, and external forces that are trying to push you toward a direction that may not be what you want to do. So who wants to start?
You want me to start?
Go for it.
So even though Montpelier has had Descendant engagement since the 1990s, the first time that slavery returned to the actual landscape that a visitor can see, vis-a-vis the Madison's time there, was not until about 2008. And this was after a 5-year restoration project between 2003 and 2008, through which Montpelier took off all the 20th century additions to the main house that the DuPont family had added in the 20th century and returned it to its appearance in the time of the Madisons. This was a 5-year, $24 million project funded by the estate of Paul Mellon. And there was a large Descendant gathering in 2007, and a group of Descendants, while touring the house during that gathering, looked out from the terrace on the upper level of the south side of the house over where there had been a three slave dwellings, 2 smokehouses, and a kitchen. But at that point, there was nothing but grass and railroad ties, and said, "Where are my people? You spent $24 million on this house. All I see here is dead grass and railroad ties." So that really made, and I wasn't there yet, but that really made everyone very much aware that we were not in any way, giving the 2 stories equal weight. So we constructed timber frame outlines based on an insurance plat that told us that these 6 buildings had been there. And then a couple of years after that, we got an NEH grant to begin to excavate those dwellings and understand them so that we could eventually reconstruct them. So, but again, Montpelier in some ways was lucky in being sort of the little redheaded stepchild to Monticello and Mount Vernon, in that we were just kind of quiet. Nobody was paying attention to us. So we were able to kind of go along, get experience working with Descendants. And then boom, in 2014, my former boss and colleague and friend, Kat Imhoff, got a $10 million gift from the philanthropist David Rubenstein, which enabled us to do all the archaeology, very carefully study the archaeology, surviving slave dwellings, and reconstruct all of them right beside the house, and then do the exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color. And this was all in partnership with the Descendant community. So all of that was very much, we did it, we internally knew that it was the right thing to do. It was what we were all committed to. But, being in a presidential site, there are people that just don't want to hear about it. There's a lot of investment in the American exceptionalist narrative, where these guys in wigs, dredged forth this brand new country based on liberty, beat off the tyrannical British government, which completely leaves out the entire story of how everything over here got built in the first place, and why it was even here. Why the colonies were successful was because the labor of people who had been held in bondage since 1619. So we've always been committed to that story, and we've gotten pushed back to one degree or another all across time. And I can talk later if somebody wants to hear about the drama there last year, but we are in the crosshairs of orgs like the Heritage Foundation and something called the Washington Examiner. But what we don't do is give them any oxygen. We just keep on keeping on doing what we do and trying to just ignoring them. But there's definitely now there's a tension on the houses of the founders in particular, and the founders who were enslavers in particular, in the kind of world of anti-woke that we're seeing today.
Yeah, the more famous the person that lived in your historic site, the more people are going to be tied to the narrative they want to hear for that person. And it does make it more difficult. We would have more money if I had a president, but then I'd have that. So I always go back and forth between the two. But I know that's a really big challenge. And I think every organization that has somebody, especially one of the founding fathers, has to deal with people that are like, why are you concentrating over there? This is what you need to be talking about. Why aren't you just talking about the Constitution all the time? I don't understand.
And what confounds me is how they see that the Constitution and slavery are like 180. No,
Mm-hmm.
they're the same thing. So
I know.
It's just all one story, and that's how we tell it.
Yeah, that's great. So how about you, Maya? What if I know that we all have our challenges, a lot of them overlap, but because of your location, the fact that you are owned by Prince George's, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So there are, and you have your own challenges. So why don't you talk to us about some of the stuff that you've gone through?
So, Nancy, the challenges question is always my favorite because it's the one where I could just cut you and Elizabeth off and I could just have this screen up for the rest of the year talking about challenges. I think my biggest challenge, if I could singularly name it, I think is a power dynamic. A power dynamic based on the history itself, a power dynamic based on the public that we decided to serve for a number of years, a power dynamic on who got to be a museum professional in that space. And then I showed up one day. I think, just at its base, when we talk about singular narratives, we did that very well for a number of years. And then admittedly, it's one of the hardest barriers I've had to break down. I still am not complete with that. We surrounded our story on Rosalie Steer Calvert, who was the mistress of Riversdale. And there's a publication about her. And as much, I've read the book. I read it years before I even came to Riversdale. I used it as a research resource to kind of understand society in Prince George's County. And I mean, this woman, the power, when we talk about power dynamics, anytime that I say my true thoughts on what I think Rosalie Steer Calvert represents and who she was as a person, the power dynamic shows up. This is a woman who not only talked ill of enslaved people, but she talked ill of her peers in America. She was, insulting to American society as a whole. She was someone who was from Antwerp, modern day Belgium. And so, a European mindset of power. And then you break that down, much like Monticello or any president's house, you have the history and the legacy of the friends groups or the blue-haired ladies who decide to save these sites and find them worthy of saving when we know that spaces that were occupied by people of color were not deemed in the same way. So there's that power dynamic. And then you talk about, your staffing. I'm the first person of color, and I know, within PG Parks, they are so sick of me saying that, but I am not going to stop saying it because I grew up in this area. I was born in Washington, D.C., raised here, went to school in and out of Prince George's County. I've worked with people from Prince George's County for a number of years, and we just did not look like what I knew we were. And so showing up and just challenging the narrative of the museum perspective of who's there. But I mean, I knew that before I got there. At GW, I was one of few people of color in the museum studies program. And, I remember seeing like a survey that said, I think it was in the 80s that African Americans don't go to museums. Well, no, if you don't see yourself there, you probably won't go there. And so, there's just a number of challenges, but I'm ready to face it head on. Some days is very, very, very draining. I remember a meeting with my team and they're like, well, we interpret women's history and we interpret a specific time frame. We are an early federal period house, and I'm just like, well, I'm the director. I say what we are. We work together, and I give people the privilege of working with me. I don't want to take credit for everything, but I knew that the person who had occupied my space before, who happened to be male, happened to be white, didn't have those challenges in conversation. And so the power dynamic still continues to show up. And, it's really challenging to go into that space and still create a positive environment around that. But even more so than that, you're working in government. And so there's government bureaucracy on top of it and how you're serving the public. And, everyone says, oh, we want to diversify the narrative. We want to tell the truth. But when you tell the truth and someone who is offended is in government, that makes it a little bit different. And so then you have to be careful all of a sudden. But I don't know how to turn off my truth. I speak it even when it's uncomfortable for people. But yeah, I think the bureaucracy is quite challenging because, of course, you're working within a fiscal year budget. And so the things that you want to do over a 5-year time span, your government is like, look, you got to spend this money by, June 30th of this year. And then I'm in a system where there's 4 other historic house museums. And so we're all competing. My site in particular, I think has created a dynamic within my park system, in that Riversdale, because of its power dynamic, it was given more attention over the years. And now, the other sites are like, what about us? What about our history? What about the history of regular everyday people? And so I think in dismantling the Rosalie Steer Calvert narrative, that will kind of help us kind of come down to everyday people, which I think has, really separated out who was coming to our museum. We had a specific audience, but as you know, the specific audience that came to places like Riversdale or Monticello or even the William Paca House, that generation is dying off, and that power dynamic showed up because those people had the authority and the privilege to donate large sums of money and dictate what we were going to show and highlight in our museum. Our collection, the first piece of art that we had in our collection, since I've been there, it did not exist before I got there. There was no intention around collecting anything connected to the enslaved experience. So we had to create it. It didn't exist. And so we worked with Chanel Compton, director of the Banneker Douglas Museum, and she is also an artist. And so I had her create a mosaic piece. And, I was just so excited that we had big fanfare around it, because I don't think, in past years that there's been this big fanfare, but anytime we got a Calvert piece, we have so many Calvert pieces in our collection that family members have been able to donate. And I don't like to shoo on that, because I think it's very much a part of the story, and we missed an opportunity in showing that although this, collection of items, artifacts, whether that be furnishings, dishes, portraiture, it's owned by the Calverts, but it had to be maintained over the years by enslaved labor. Like who made those dishes? Who cleaned the dishes? Who served the dishes? So, just thinking about things in a multi-tiered perspective, a multivocal perspective is how I try to show up and challenge that in everything that I do. I do share space with my team. I try not to be the only person, but I recognize that as the only person of color, there's so many people that still need to see me. And so I work closely with our local community, which has even been challenging for me, because our community now is largely Spanish speaking. And so there's a language barrier, there's a cultural barrier, how, Spanish speaking communities actually live and work socially. They're very, I don't want to say insular, but, anybody coming into this country, you become insular by way of our power dynamic. And so it's not so easy to kind of break those barriers that we have with the community, but we slowly do it. So I do things like create summer internship opportunities. There's volunteer opportunities that people can have, and like trying to create those vacancies where we're doing things like making them bilingual so that individuals who are in that community know they can also apply for those jobs as well. So that's where I stand on, our issues at Riversdale.
And for the audience tonight, we're just barely touching on the issues. I mean, for us, for an organization that's dependent upon membership, sponsorships, and special events for our money, you're always realizing if you, there's always who's going to withhold funding and who's going to have the power dynamic of funding going on with it. And you have to find a way to hold true. At the same time, museums are for everybody. And I want everybody to feel like they can come and hear. They may not hear what they're expecting to hear. They may get stories that they weren't expecting. But I want to be inclusive, and I know and all of us feel that as well. Finding that I don't want to just preach to the choir. I want to get people whose hearts are going to be touched, and they're going to find an empathy with our stories. But you still have to be real, and no matter what the purse strings are, or anything else, you need to hold true for what we know that we need to be doing, and that's not always an easy thing. So the challenges are so much greater than even what we're talking about right now, internal and external. But I do want to make sure that we're addressing, because both of your organizations are connecting to descendants. And that, Elizabeth, you've talked about a little bit. I'd love for you to talk about a little bit more. And Maya, I do want to have you talk about how we're using those connections and what your journey, what your organization's journey has been with the Descendant community, and kind of where you hope it's going. So, Elizabeth, you talked about it a little bit. So why don't you elaborate first?
Sure. Yeah. So I talked about the long-standing collaboration between Descendants and Montpelier staff going back to the 90s. And the sort of big culmination of it was the project to create the Mere Distinction of Color exhibition. Mm-hmm. But what we all realized along the way is that every project and process that happened, before 2019, it was that we at Montpelier, the staff members, as almost entirely white museum professionals, who we would say, oh, we're going to do this project. Let's invite this person and that person and this person and that person. We were deciding who, where we're going to ask in to be collaborators and advisors. So, it was really an extractive process. And there was no, the Descendant didn't have an organization or even any kind of way of equally sharing power with Montpelier. We did eventually get to the point where we would write into grants honoraria for Descendants for projects where they were partners. But it wasn't until 2019 when the Descendants created their own organization, the Montpelier Descendants Committee, that we were working really as equals. So that's something that I think Descendant communities should really think about is, how are you engaging with the organization that represents the plantation site? And something that I say all the time now is that at Montpelier, the relationships were largely Descendant community members and Montpelier staff members, and we working together, and we developed extremely close and good working relationships and very good and deep friendships. The problem was the connections and the contact did not go to the level of the executive leadership and the board. And that was what caused the massive breakdown that happened at Montpelier in the spring of 2022. Something else that I should mention is that so we opened Mere Distinction of Color in June of 2017. And then as a result of that, we thought that it might be useful to share what we'd learned by the, now over 20 years of working with Descendants. So in early 2018, we convened what we call the National Summit on Teaching Slavery. And we invited Descendants from sites all over the US. We invited museum professionals and we invited academics to come together and to brainstorm for a long weekend in creating a rubric of best practices for Descendant engagement in interpreting slavery at museums and historic sites. And so that, after the weekend, we had a smaller writing committee that actually created the document, which I can post in the chat or it's on Montpelier's website, or I can send it to Nancy to share. Mm-hmm. But that document ended up being used in ways that we didn't even think about. For example, a site of Japanese internment during World War II. Wow. Has let us know that it's been really helpful to them as well. So, but what ended up happening at Montpelier is that, the staff, the people who did the day in and day out work that made the site go, we understood the Descendant collaboration as, really the DNA of the organization. In early 2020, there was a complete leadership change at Montpelier where a new president and a new board chair came in short succession. And for whatever reason, and I'm not going to speculate, but those people did not know, were not aware of either the rubric or how critical the staff understood Descendant collaboration to be. And so relationships with the Montpelier Descendant Committee, the MDC, and the new leadership got off to a rocky start. The Montpelier Foundation, the MDC wanted to do a joint statement with the Montpelier Foundation after the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, and the Montpelier Foundation wouldn't agree on that. It's just a long road of difficulty. But then in the summer of 2021, the Montpelier board voted to work towards a relationship of structural parity. That's of shared power and authority with the MDC. And that's the highest level of the rubric, is that there's shared power and authority between descendants and staff members at every level of the organization. But despite that, they were unable, even with working with very skilled mediators, they were unable to come to an agreement. And then in March of last year, the Montpelier Foundation board announced that it was not going to work towards structural parity with the MDC, but that they were going to choose who the descendants were that they were going to work with, not the democratically elected group that actually represented all of the descendants we'd worked with for 25 years. So when several colleagues and I stood up and publicly sided with the MDC, we were fired. And there was a lot of media press about this, which was great. I mean, and the field could not have been more supportive and more, just it showed us the love in such a big way. Very, very, very long story short, the old guard eventually sort of gave up. And so the way structural parity works is that the Montpelier Descendant Committee nominates half of the candidates for half of the board seats on the Montpelier Foundation. And they were ready in the wings with incredible nominees. And so in May last year, the new board with half the nominees nominated by the MDC, that board was seated and everything has been moving ahead since then. But I cannot say it has not been very difficult, and we have absolutely lost funders. And we're working towards, meeting our new funders, basically. I'm sorry to be so long-winded about that.
No, it's, this journey is not without its setbacks and its pitfalls. You always hope you're making the right choice. Sometimes you wonder if you are, and sometimes it's not the right choice, but you don't have the power to change it. And then hopefully something happens, like the community rallies behind Montpelier, which they did. I mean, there were so many people that said, no, what are you doing? And the change you swung back the other direction.
Yeah. One of the things that I've definitely learned is that progress is not linear.
It is not linear. And look at our nation. We step forward, back. Oh my gosh, it can be exhausting. But having that descendant, I think it's incredible what you have set up. I think that we are so blessed. In fact, I've been noticing in the chat, I've got a number of my wonderful descendants are actually on the chat. Angela and Jerome and Mickey and Donald and Trudy and so many others are there joining us tonight. I probably missed one of you. I'm so sorry. I'm going to try not to stare at the chat. But we have incredible descendants who are in all kinds of leadership roles, both on our board, where we've had people, but also serving on really important committees and willing to get up in front of groups and talk on our behalf and do it with such grace and eloquence. And they're inspiring people all the time. I am constantly inspired by them. And just as you were saying, the heart of the work that we're doing, they exemplify this, and I am constantly in awe of each and every one of them. It is truly incredible. So Maya, tell us about your journey with the descendants at Riversdale.
So I have to say, like, our journey is very early and new. We've definitely had people like Reverend Jerome Fowler at the table for a number of years, but I think that he was like the face and the voice of the Plummer family, and like other family members, they didn't really want to engage in the same way that he was doing it, and I think you find that with almost any family across the country. And as we got there, like I've been following, I read the rubric, was one of the first things that I read. And then I reached out to Sotterley to see what I knew what you guys were doing because I've known you for a while before then, but like really surveying what's taking shape at other historic house museums across the country to see how they're engaging with descendants, what have been the successes, what have been some of the challenges, and thinking about being very intentional. And, like I don't know where we started, but I know that, we're in the midst of the journey. And like some of the things we've been able to do is we actually created a small Descendant network group, and we are building out like our database to connect with the descendants. And we, in this last 2 years since I've been there, have been able to connect with a number of descendants that didn't really engage before. And we're doing something that I don't think we had done before, is just ask, like, how do you want to engage? And not present an opportunity and say, well, this is what we got on our menu, sign up.
Right.
And so, it's a conversation, and it's a lesson in trust building and relationship building that I think has taught me a lot. I had my own assumptions about how it could go, but it has given me a lot of patience and learning and understanding that it's a difficult journey, and why people were connected with us for one reason or another, or not. It varies. It's not the same for every family member. Some of the family members didn't even know each other. And one of the fortunate things that I have by way of a Calvert collection is that we have a private set of Calvert family papers that are on loan to us. And in that, we discovered other families besides the Plumbers. Adam Francis Plummer's daughter, Nellie, in the 20s, actually wrote a book called Out of the Depths, where she named like 13 other surnames. And we never thought that we'd find those other surnames as individual people. And this collection has allowed us to kind of build out family groupings and try to connect with descendant communities. We created a document that we put out at every event to kind of solicit people. Do you think you're related to us? Like, do you think we're connected to Riversdale? We want to hear your story. Reach out to us, and we will see what we can share with you. Because a part of this for me, more than anything, is that I recognize through enslavement, whether that's 17th, 18th, 19th century, families were separated. And it broke down a family dynamic that I think has directly impacted how we show up today in 2023. And so I'm always trying to reconnect people with their family legacies. And so I've really enjoyed that part of it. And every time Elizabeth spoke earlier on, I kept saying to myself, I keep forgetting to say that Riversdale, we are 30 years old. June the 12th, we turned 30. And we now need to start thinking about the next 30 years. And one of the things that I wanted to do as we entered into this was be more intentional about working with descendants. And so I'm excited that just last week, a descendant actually started an internship with us. Kaya Plummer, who is a descendant who's a student at Howard University, who's studying museum and library sciences. And so I'm just like, how fortunate are we that we got to do that? And we have another student, Emily, actually Laura Reed DeMarco from the University of Maryland, and we are the Founders House. That's a part of our legacy, is that the founder of the Maryland Agricultural College, Charles Benedict Calvert, son of Rosalie and George Calvert, was the founder of that school. And so we want to keep that relationship. But of course, over the years, that relationship had kind of been prioritized. We were getting students from UMD, which has its own legacy of a power dynamic in the state of Maryland, as opposed to the other schools that are in the state and within the county. And so we were very intentional about reaching out to students from Bowie State University, which was a historically Black college and university, and then also offering this internship for a descendant. And I think it's really going to be refreshing for us to kind of get a descendant's feedback from a different generation. As someone who didn't have a long-standing history with our site, I think it's going to be really, really exciting. And so I can't wait to hear back some of the feedback, what she thinks of our tours, what she thinks about our overall interpretation, what she thinks about descendant engagement, all those things. And so those are the ways in which we're connecting. And I'm reconnecting with people who may have been connected in the past. Reverend Fowler serves on 2 committees for me. We actually have a focus group that we are working on an exhibition, a permanent exhibition on the enslaved at Riversdale. And he sits on that group. And then within our Descendant network group, he's also participating in that. And I keep saying, Reverend Fowler, you got to send me the next generation person, because, none of us are going to be here forever. And so we want to think about that continuity and sustainability in that relationship with the descendants, because it can really fall off. When you hear people say, I'm one paycheck away from being homeless, that's how I feel about this descendant connection. And so I don't take it for granted. I try to be very intentional about connecting with descendants. And so we are very much in our infancy stage of the journey, but we are slowly growing and learning from sites like yours and Elizabeth's.
Yeah, Mr. Fowler's just delightful. I was entranced getting to see him when I went up to your site for the event. It was just wonderful. We've formalized we've had descendants of, I said on the board since the 1990s. We formalized our Descendants project the year that we dedicated our slave cabin exhibit to Agnes King Callum. So that was done in 2018 and 2017. So we have over 200 self-identified descendants, but our approach is slightly different. It fits the way that we tell our story, because we have such an expansive way that we're telling it. For us, and for those of you who don't know, it's everybody who lived and labored here. We have owner descendants, enslaved descendants, 20th century farm laborer descendants. If your story is connected during that period, your story is intertwined, and it is that dynamic of discussions that come from having somebody who's on our board right now. We have an owner descendant whose family owned our enslaved descendant. That connection is right there. But as Gwen will often say, she'll say, am I supposed to not like her? I liked her before I realized that. Am I supposed to stop liking her? But we can show that you can talk about this, because if I can talk about it with her, we all should be able to talk about that. So our dynamic, I know, Elizabeth, your dynamic is different because because you don't have the descendants from the Madisons. So yours is just going to be from one aspect.
Although we do define it very broadly. I mean, you have to be a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, but you don't have to have they could have been enslaved anywhere. I mean, anybody who resonates with what we're doing is welcome. There's not a restriction for joining.
And I love that, because we always say, if you think you've got a connection, fill out a descendants form, because I think for any of our sites, when people go to them, they may not know where they're from, but their stories are the same kinds of stories they will hear at sites like ours. So we are part of their history, as you were saying, in a way that some people may not be thinking about. But it's true. I love that you're doing it that way. I do see a couple of questions I'm going to pop over. I see one from one of our descendants, Trudy Talafer, who's here from California. Hi, Trudy. She said, this question is actually for Elizabeth. Describe your efforts to reach Black descendants in Montpelier. Is there a group doing extensive work to reach out to find Black descendants who are invisible right there in the Orange and Spotsylvania counties?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first large-scale local connections started in the later 1990s, when the Montpelier archaeologists identified the Montpelier burial ground where the enslaved community members, rest. And when that was announced, and that really brought a lot of interest from the local community. That plus the project to restore the Gilmore farm, and Rebecca Gilmore Coleman and Carolyn French founded the Orange County African American Historical Society. And so that organization was really the first catalyst for local, Orange, Madison, Spotsylvania, the neighboring Louisa, Fluvanna, the neighboring counties of people to, do genealogy, look out at, what they, could learn about their own families. And then it got a little more national when families shared it. When, like Maya does, we have an enslaved person from Montpelier, Paul Jennings, who wrote an autobiography in his own life. It was a little pamphlet that was published in his own lifetime in the 1870s. and his family had always known their story. And so they connected. And then there was an enslaved man named Benjamin McDaniel. So it just kind of grew like that. And now that the Montpelier Descendants Committee is its own 501c3 nonprofit organization, they are the central, sort of group. Although we provide research support all the time for people, who want to know more about what we can help them with their family story. So it's just kind of been an organic thing, and sharing it in families is still a really big part of it.
Probably if there's one wish that I had, and so if there are any great researchers or genealogists out there that want to help us, probably one of the biggest dreams I have is doing a lot more research to reach more of our descendants. Jeannie Pertle, our former director of educational program partnership, who's on with us tonight. Hi, Jeannie. Has done on her own time an incredible amount of research. We also have Jerome Spears on tonight, one of our descendants, who has done incredible genealogical research. Certainly the people that are doing that research on our behalf and sharing their stories and the family stories absolutely help us. But, all of our sites should probably be able to go up into the thousands before all is said and done. And there's a hope that I have. It's a way to really get some extensive research and make those connections. And it's because it's one of the difficulties, I think, is trying to find more people. And I will say the fact that we had an owner and an enslaved descendant on the board when Sotterley was deemed one of the 11 most endangered historic sites in America and almost closed, and that provided that model. And I give both of them credit. Certainly Agnes King Callum, who was on this board when her family said, "What in heaven's name are you doing on the board of that plantation? Or have you lost your mind?" And she came down and said, "But these are my stories." At a time when other people were trying to take down that slave cabin and that slave dwelling, that represents my people. It's not going to happen. There needs to be somebody advocating for this. And she created, I think, for us, and the way that John Hanson embraced the knowledge that she gave him and said, "Yes, you're right. We need to tell the stories. Sotterley needs to tell this," created a safe space for descendants in a way. It's not as though it's not extraordinarily difficult for many people to walk onto this site and know what happened to their ancestors. So there's still pain, there can still be anger, there are a lot of emotions to work through. But I think for those organizations, and I know you both talk to organizations that are not even beginning to acknowledge it and trying to figure out how to do it, how do you create that element of trust? And that takes time. How are you going to honor their stories? Are you going to be that person that takes my family stories seriously? And that takes trust, and it's a hard thing. There is a question from Debbie. She said, "Descendants Day at Sotterley was incredible." Thank you, Debbie. But not well attended by non-descendants. What do you do to try to attract a broader public to such special occasions? And I don't know if you guys have the same issues. We had this, she's referring to a wonderful day of unity and healing that took place last year. And there were a lot of people there was a diverse audience, but there certainly were a lot of people from either our descendants or from our African American community. And I just even our local Juneteenth celebration, that should have been everybody in the community. This is a national holiday. Everybody should have been there. But you tend to show different audiences. You'll have one audience for certain events and one audience for others. And I don't know that we've broken that code. I think we are trying personally to try to create that space where everyone is welcome, and that we want everybody to feel like no matter where you are, you're part of this nation's history. Your stories are part of this, but we're asking you to embrace everyone's stories. That everyone's stories are part of our stories, not just the select few. And slowly that's happening, but it's a challenge. And I don't know if any of you want to address similar challenges at your organizations.
I would say we probably are at the same place. I don't think it's a unique situation. I think anytime you bring enslavement into something, there's this discomfort, and so it doesn't lend itself to people saying, "Sign me up." Um, I try to use genealogy as my tool. I think nationally, like genealogy is that one hobby that people just love and they get really excited about it. And so I try to take that and center genealogy and bring people in that way. I just think that it's a lot of fun. I do it myself. And so I really just try to look at ways that I can reach different people, meet them where they're at currently, and hope to educate them over time. But it's really a challenge. I don't think I have the answer yet.
Yeah. How about you?
It's totally the same for us. We had a really wonderful Juneteenth celebration this past Saturday, and there was a great local turnout, but it was, mostly the African-American community. But then people who were coming to visit that day anyway and didn't know about Juneteenth also took part, and that was great. And we also do a series of online programs every week between Juneteenth, or maybe it's the beginning of June and July 4th. And those, when we publicize them with our colleagues in the MDC, in the Orange County African American Historical Society, those get great turnout, way better turnout than our Montpelier only sponsored virtual events. So that's been really interesting.
Yeah, and co-sponsoring absolutely helps to bring in other audiences. And you're right, my genealogy is such I hate to say hobby. I think it's like an addictive passion for everybody I know who has delved into that. I started, once you get on ancestry.com, you're probably going to be lost forever into this world because you just can't stop. But finding ways that with those loves that people have, and realizing that when you explore your genealogy, you may find all kinds of connections you weren't expecting. And when people find those connections and like, oh, okay, I guess my history is more diverse than I thought, it sometimes opens them up to other conversations. And sometimes it's also about conversations on equity. I mean, we have a Growing for Good program where we grow produce on site and donate it to local food pantries. We've done about 150,000 pounds in the last 9 years. And it's about equity of voice, equity of stories, equity of food equity. Sometimes there are backdoor ways of bringing people in to say, oh, let me look at things a little bit differently. But we haven't broken the code completely yet. And every time I get somebody in who isn't the normal audience that we get, is somebody who expands it, then I count that as a win. It's one more person to help spread that message. So I'm always excited. There was a question that I had wanted to ask both of you. What are, as we're looking at goals for the future, and we mentioned this a little bit, but what are some of the goals that you are hoping to achieve with your organization in this vision and moving it forward? What are some of the places, if you're saying 5-10 years down the road, what are some of your hopes for your organization?
Well, I will say one of my biggest hopes is that when I mentioned government bureaucracy, I neglected to say that we exist within a park system, which makes it really hard for us to really advocate as a museum what our needs are to help us meet our goals and help them understand, because everything is like this big push for recreation. And it's like, we're a museum. We can't be like all things to fit in recreation. We can't do like fitness week, every year. We can't do summer camps every year. Like, we're trying to, it's like we're treading to keep our head above water to meet the needs of an audience that's not even really interested and connected to us. Like I think in the park systems, you have your county citizens who are using their dollars to like send their kids to like summer camps and recreation opportunities. So one of my biggest goals is to kind of have the park system think of this as the Department parks planning and museums at some point. Like I would love that, because I think, in a world where our federal government has both the National Park Service and the Smithsonian, there is a space to kind of help the public understand what that is. And as we kind of do that, further hone in on the educational opportunity of helping people just understand who we are and what we are. I think that there's been a disconnect over the years. And so I'd really like to be better and more diligent about helping people understand how, Riverdale came to be and how it still impacts directly the society that we live in.
And that dynamic of being in a parks and planning where you don't fit the stereotypical, most people are not even going to realize that's a real, what a museum should be doing is so different than, just a normal recreational activity. And that's a challenge that I don't have to face and that you do. And that's a tough one.
It's very challenging, especially because a lot of people, I'm fortunate that a lot of people use our grounds every day. They walk their dogs, they come with their children, and they use the grounds. But of course, as people see this as their park, rules are often broken. And, I have to pick my battles every day. Do I chase the guy that's all the way across the yard to say, please put your dog on a leash, this is not safe for everybody else? Or, like there's just so many little things that people don't think about. Or do I take the moment and like tell someone who's like taking items from our historic garden? And, I have to kind of pick my battles. We like Elizabeth and Nancy, like try to give food away when we can, but we also use it for our 19th century cooking. So, if we don't have it to cook with because it's been taken, that makes it challenging. But, like I keep saying, we want to be a community resource. And so it's just like, me being on people's backs about small infractions, I don't know if that's the best use of my time. And so it helps me understand that I have to be better about relationship building with the community as the leader of this museum. And so that's my goal, is to do more community outreach and connections, and then also stay strong in the truth telling that we're doing at Riversdale.
Yeah. And in such an urban environment, you have an interesting ability to connect to audiences that would be more difficult for me to connect to. Would I love to connect to people farther away from me and have them come down? Absolutely. I want people from all over coming and realizing these are your stories here. This may be Southern Maryland, but we're not just a Southern Maryland story. Neither are either of your sites. But I think you have probably some unique opportunities as well as challenges being in a more urban environment. It truly you do. And I hope that you have, and I know, Maya, you will have every success because I know you on that one. So I'm sure you will have wonderful milestones. Now, and Elizabeth, how about you? If you're looking at 5, 10 years down the road?
Yeah, so we're really, we are just starting out at the staff level, at the day-to-day level of figuring out how we're going to walk the walk of this structural parity. We got it going on now at the board level, but one of the things we've realized, is that, at Montpelier, we are museum professionals. This is what we do, all day long, most days. And the members of the MDC have full-time careers and lives and families, and they are doing this work as volunteers. And so they do not have the same bandwidth that we do. And to work together successfully, we got to figure all this out. And so that is actually literally part of what we are doing every day now. And I just want us to get to the point where we can be a model for other sites, to see how does this work on the ground every day. And we're really lucky in that last spring, we got a grant from the Mellon Foundation to memorialize the Montpelier burial ground. And Mellon was incredibly interested in putting some funds in there for us to document the whole process, because it would be like parity in action. So that's going to launch later this summer, and that's going to be a really, really good opportunity to figure all this out and then like record it, in every way while it's going on. So I think that's probably my biggest goal, is to figure out structural parity on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. So I want to let everybody know we have a few more minutes to be able to take any questions, but I do want to talk to you both about, I think the way that museum professionals have looked at their roles as museums has changed in recent years. There was just a thought about preservation for a long time with museums. Just here's something, here's what it did. I think museums look at themselves as having a different role now, not only within their communities, but within society at large. And I wanted to get some of your thoughts on what you feel like our changing roles as museums need to be within the communities that we serve. So Maya, you want to start for us?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things I've learned and I've seen is that we can step back and not feel like we are the only authority or the best authority or the highest authority. I think that is the main thing that we are doing in terms of our roles. We've over the years made assumptions, and rightfully so, about what the successes are. I think we're going to find relief in smaller successes. Like, you kind of have to take them and, they make small changes in your organization. And thinking about, like this field of museums, and as I shared before, who gets to be a staff member at this museum? I'd love to have a Descendant as a tour guide or any other position that impacts how we better connect with the community and tells our story. And so, breaking down some of those structural dynamics, even coming down to a job position, like we have to really think about how all those things show up. And like, we have like all these expectations of education and things like that. And those are all great. And there's place for that. But how do we do both and be fair about it, and not say, well, you don't have a bachelor's or you don't have a master's or you don't have a doctorate, so no, you don't deserve this amount of money, this amount, or you get to be front facing with the community, you need to be behind the scenes. And I just think about years ago I had an internship at the Smithsonian, and I was initially supposed to be working on the Brown versus the Board of Education 50th anniversary, but they weren't ready to start the project. And so I got, a little side project thrown at me to say, let's look at the staff dynamics of the Smithsonian. And you're looking at the early days of the 1900s, and all of the people of color are either, in the cooking staff or they're the cleaning staff. And, how those people like created community around being othered. And that's where you start to see that power dynamic and that segregation. And so I want to dismantle that. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we have to offer, is figuring out how to break down that segregation that we have created through modern museum practice. That's what I'd like to see.
I loved your line that you kicked it off with. We shouldn't act like we have all the answers. And Elizabeth, I talked about going to your site and hearing somebody say that. And I thought, how brave and incredible to tell everybody, we're not going to say that we know all the answers. And we want to hear what you say too. Because sometimes I've learned from guests when I've given a tour. And we're sometimes so shorthanded here. I was giving tours. Jeannie Pearl, who's with us tonight, she and I were trading off Saturdays during the pandemic, giving tours. Sometimes you learn from somebody who's on, and you never know who's going to be on your tour. And sometimes you've got somebody who gives you a perspective you didn't think about, that you need to bring in. And there will be groups that I've talked to that they give me a perspective that I didn't think about before, but it's something that my organization needs to be looking at. So I think that is an incredibly important point for all museums, to not always act like we're the authority, but we're the place that can bring people together to explore what the answers need to be, not just assume that we've got the answers and I'm going to lecture you on what they are, because I don't think that's our role. Elizabeth, how about you? What are you thinking about the changing role of museums?
Museums cannot afford to be bastions of elite culture like they used to be. I mean, I'm going to date myself by saying that I've been in museums now for basically over 30 years, and I love the way things have changed. I have personally changed. I used to be more of a shut up and listen kind of person. Listen to me. But now I only believe that you have to meet people where they are, because if your goal is to change someone's mind about something, if they can't hear you, they can't change. They can't learn anything, and they can't go home with anything new in their head. So you got to meet people where they are. And then I also believe that sites like ours, former sites of enslavement, sites of trauma, sites of conscience, we have an unbelievable opportunity as public places to become places for the kind of conversations that we have to have in this country around race, equity, social justice, diversity, multiculturalism, and really, I mean, I'm not even being hyperbolic, like the future of our democracy. Those are the kind of things we can talk about with the public at our sites because we know how to do it. And it's crucial.
And we're places, we should be places for everyone, and be places where, and I've people have heard me say this before, that, and one of the activities that we had with the Big Conversation, which is an incredible group here that's dismantling racism in Southern Maryland. And we were co-sponsoring an event with them. And this gentleman who came for the day and came and participated, he at the end of the day had said, "Thank you for allowing me to be comfortable in my discomfort." And we can't say that sometimes people aren't going to be uncomfortable when they hear stories. But our goal is not to put them on the spot to make them uncomfortable. Our point is to bring out the reality. And sometimes our discomfort is going to be because we didn't realize that what we thought was reality wasn't. That there's so much that we didn't understand about our shared history that makes you start questioning. You go back and you think about things that you thought you knew growing up, and you thought were your bedrock of this is right and this is how things are, and you realize, oh my gosh, if I step to this direction and I look at this thing from a different angle, I need to start thinking differently. And you see that with the children that come here on site for education programs. I see that with the adults that come here. But we want this to be a place for everybody, and a place that we can find a better way to explore this history together and be that place. And I know you both are going to be that place for your institutions and for your communities. And our communities aren't just the people who are right around us. Hopefully with this new virtual and digital world, we can reach more and more audiences to embrace that. And I think if museums can't be that as safer places for everybody, I don't know who's going to do it, because it can be such a polarizing topic because of people who are trying to make it that way. And it's not about politics. It's just about truth.
Mm-hmm.
So did either one of you have any final comments or questions that you wanted to bring up here as we wrap up this evening?
One thing I do want to say is that, I first went to Sotterley in 2012, and I was working at Monticello then. And when I went to Sotterley, there was a gentleman, I remember he was the treasurer of the board, and he was a Descendant. And I was blown away by how much, like light years further ahead Sotterley was than Monticello. The only organization that I think may have been, with you was Somerset Place in North Carolina. So Sotterley is a pioneer and a real, walker of the walk. So,
thank you.
You.
In fact, that would have been Donald Barber, and he's on tonight. So Donald, the shout out to Donald, who is actually a trustee emeritus for us now. He has served more years than anybody else on the board. and he is incredible, as our other descendants who are part of this. So thank you. That's a very kind shout out. I appreciate it. We have a long way to go, and I think, and I know we absolutely don't have all the answers yet. 100% we don't. But with the incredible descendants that we have, who have honored us with their family stories and their history and their voices, I'm confident that we will continue to get to a better place, and we're blessed. Maya, do you have anything you wanted to add here at the end?
Oh my goodness, Nancy. I just want to say it's just been such a pleasure to share this platform with both you and Elizabeth, and to have people who've been in this field for much longer than me, just kind of share this space and learn from you, and know that I have people out there that are going through the same things. And, like, to have the community of descendants here for that support and hearing what we have to say is just really, really, really delightful. And so I'm super excited to see where we go even after tonight.
Well,
I'm super excited.
One of the things that makes me hopeful for the future is when I know that people like Maya are in the field, really. So you're amazing.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate it.
You both are. You're incredible. We're having all kinds of thank yous coming out. Thank you to everybody for the outstanding work that everybody's doing. I'm just so grateful. You all know, who are in the audience now, why I adore these two women this much. And with people like this who believe in doing what's right, not always what's easy, that's how we're going to keep moving forward. And we are so grateful to everybody who's part of this conversation. I do want to let everybody know that if you look on the buttons on the side, you'll see offers, and you're going to see a link to our next presentation. This is actually going to be done as a hybrid. You can join us in person, or you can join us virtually. Richard Bell is coming back to talk about his book, Stolen. And Maya, I know you're probably familiar with that book. He's a University of Maryland professor, and that's going to be in July. So we're going to continue this conversation. But ladies, I am beyond grateful for your expertise, for your leadership in this field, and for all that you are doing to really tell that honest and true history that needs to come. And I am just so honored to be in this field with both of you. It gives me hope. It does.
Right back at you.
Same, for sure.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. We appreciate your joining us. We hope that you will continue the conversations with us. Follow Sotterley for the Common Ground Initiative. We hope that you become members of the Sotterley family. To all of you, good night, and thank you for joining us. Take care.
Okay.